Hello, and thank you for choosing Note Designer, psychotherapy note writing software for mental health professionals. In this video, the first of two parts about types of psychotherapy notes, I'm going to review the most common note types that clinicians tend to use to write their daily progress notes. Please note that this will be more of an educational presentation explaining the different note types and not a comprehensive tutorial about Note Designer itself. We do, however, have other videos that focused more specifically on how to use Note Designer and all of its options for customization, which you can find on our webpage or in the Help menu. Let me start by saying no one note type is better than any other in an absolute sense. It's more that certain settings, clinics, or organizations may require that your notes conform to a particular structure. Note Designer includes four main types of progress note: Basic, SOAP, BIRP, and DAP, sometimes called DARP. You'll also find Basic Plus and SOAP Plus note types in Note Designer. These are just expanded forms of our original Basic and SOAP notes. Let's walk through the different note types to examine how they are organized and what they include so that you can determine what may be the best fit for your own note writing or professional need. We'll first consider Basic Note Plus. Basic Note Plus is organized according to the main content areas that characterize what we consider to be a comprehensive psychotherapy progress note. The information we'll see is organized in a manner that follows what happens in a session from the beginning through the middle and to the end. These main content areas appear as tabs across the top of the note workspace from left to right in Note Designer. So here we see headings, presentation, state, assessment, themes, treatment, and progress. The Headings tab is where you can enter the demographic information about the patient and the session. So things like the patient's name, date, start time, end time, fee, CPT codes, and diagnostic codes. Next, we have the Presentation tab. This is where we document session format, essentially where the session took place. As is characteristic of Note Designer, you are presented with a list of possible statements that you can choose from by clicking your selections on the left-hand screen, as your note narrative gets composed on the right-hand screen. After this, we have Appearance, which includes two categories, one corresponding to how the client approached the session, for instance, whether they were accompanied and by whom, as well as their observed emotional approach to the setting, for instance, whether they were reluctant or perhaps eager to begin. And last, we have some items here that correspond to the client's physical appearance and demeanor. So we click our selections over here, and the note is created over there on the right. Keep in mind, you don't have to use every tab or sub-tab we offer. These are just guidelines, and it's up to individual clinicians to determine what is best for their own practice. Next, we have the State tab, with various sub-tabs here corresponding to the client's reported affective state, the client's observed affective state, and mental state. So let's click on a few for the reported and the observed affective state. You'll see the mental state subtab has a few categories, some of the content making it similar to a mini mental status examination. So here we have orientation, intellectual and memory function, and then the general mental state of the client. At the end of the tab, we also include two subtabs that describe the client's overall functioning. One of them is similar to the older GAF, and the other somewhat like the HUDAS of the DSM. Again, you only have to use the content you need. For instance, not all clinicians document a client's levels of functioning for every session. In the Basic Note Plus, we've also now included a place for the clinician to document any assessment instruments used, as well as any relevant results. These, by necessity, simply offer a place for you to write in what you used and what you found. In the next section of the basic note, we document the main themes of the session. Here, of course, there's a lot of content to choose from as there's so many things a client may discuss or explore during a session. To reduce some of this complexity, you'll see the themes arranged by categories: relational, couple-family, trauma, identity, process, mourning, etc. Please remember, you can also go in and hide any statements you don't ever think you'll be using, and you can also like statements with a little heart indicator for items you tend to use more frequently, basically customizing the note template to suit your practice. So let's click on a few and watch as our note gets written without us actually having to write anything. This next tab is labeled Treatment. This is the point in the basic note where you document your interventions. It is good to keep in mind that this is a very important part of your documentation, one that sometimes people forget to include. That is, to explain what you did as a clinician during the session to intervene, assist, or otherwise guide or counsel your client. As with the themes, there are a number of possible interventions we may make, and so we've organized these around some of the more common treatment interventions. So here we have supportive clinical management, cognitive behavioral, which in this case we included DBT, mindfulness, and ACT within that subtab. We have psychodynamic analytic, and then a collection of other interventions put together towards the end. It's here that we'll find some couple and family interventions, as well as EMDR, and some relating to the work in the addictions field. Of course, you can always add your own statements to suit your particular clinical context, or consult our library to find and import new content we may have added. After we document our interventions, we may then choose to also document any reactions the client may have had to our interventions. We do this using the second subtab over here. The final tab in the basic note is called Progress. This is where we document things such as significant developments, outstanding therapeutic issues or concerns, and some comments about our ongoing treatment plan. We may also choose to comment on the expected time frame for meeting our goals and objectives. Some insurance companies require that this be documented. And finally, we might here mention any homework assigned and the date and time of the next session. As a last step, it's usually required that we sign our notes, which can be done in Note Designer by uploading your signature or using our electronic writing pad to create one. And there we have our well-written narrative-style progress note on the right, ready to copy-paste into our client file. As we saw, the basic note presents the information we need to document in an organized manner, generally following the logic of what happens in a session from beginning to end. Although this is a common method for organizing a note, there are others, so let's take a look at those. The next type of note we'll consider is called the SOAP note. This is a very popular note structure, originally used in the medical field, but now applied in a number of other healthcare-related disciplines such as psychology and counseling. SOAP is a catchy acronym standing for Subjective, Objective, Assessment, and Plan. These are the content areas that organize the SOAP note, and in Note Designer are listed from left to right as tabs across the top of the note page after the Headings tab. Let's now explore exactly what all these tabs are about. The Headings tab is the same as in the basic note, and as mentioned includes all the demographic type of information, so your client's name, date of the session, and so on. Once that is done, let's click the Subjective tab and see what's there. Subjective corresponds to content from the session that derives from the client's own subjective experience of how they are feeling, what concerns them, what they are dealing with, and anything else that they may report directly during a session. Again, this is not your opinion or evaluation of the client, but more directly what they themselves report or talk about. So in this tab, we have Reported Affective State, documenting what the client told us about how they are feeling. It is here we also document the main themes discussed by the client during the session. These themes are subjective in that they capture the topics discussed by the client and correspond to their own experiences, both internal and external. As in the basic note, these themes are organized according to different content areas: relational, couple and family, trauma, mourning, adjustment, and so on. Again, if the content discussed by the client is not captured by one of the Note Designer statements, you can add the specific content yourself and may choose to save that for your future notes as well. At the end of this tab, we've included a space for you to include any other information you believe should be documented that captures something of the client's subjective experience. This is under Other Issues Reported. The next tab is Objective. As the name implies, the information in this section of the note corresponds to observable, objective information that is readily apparent during the session. Here we would include, for instance, things you may have observed as a clinician that would be readily observable in a somewhat concrete manner by another clinician or related professional. In general, it is to include content that is more fact-based, perhaps verifiable, and often quantifiable. Of course, one could easily debate what is truly subjective and objective and how to differentiate between them in the context of the complexity of psychotherapeutic practice, but we'll leave that to the philosophers among us for now. Likely, these distinctions are somewhat clearer if we were in a strictly medical context. In Note Designer's SOAP Plus, under Objective, you'll find the session format. Objectively, that's where the session took place. Appearance, including such things as the client's punctuality, as well as their physical appearance, how they were dressed perhaps, and other such observables. Under Objective, we also have included the observed affective state of the client, making it clear that this is what you as the clinician observed, likely quantifiable perhaps by a number or some physical indicator on the part of the client, and or that would be quantified by, let's say, an affect measure. As well, we have here the subtab for mental state, where again we can include our observations about the client's assessed orientation, intellectual and memory functions, and cognitive preoccupations, or observed general mental state. Next, let's turn to the Assessment tab. In this section of the note, we are to document what impressions and conclusions we have come to as based on everything we observed, assessed, and that has been reported to us by the client. In Note Designer, this begins with the subtab related to our impressions regarding the client's functioning, one of those being based on the global assessment, the other corresponding to more specific content areas, similar to the HUDAS from the DSM. Here we can also note any biopsychosocial factors that we discovered and that should be documented. We have also included here a space for the clinician to note any specific assessment instruments used, followed by any relevant findings or conclusions drawn. Under the Assessment tab, we also include any significant developments that can be noted, as well as any outstanding therapeutic issues that we've identified. This brings us to our last section of the SOAP note, which is the Plan tab. As the name implies, this is where we include our ongoing treatment plan, time frame to meet our goals or objectives, and assigned homework, and the date and time of the next session. What is less intuitive is that this is also the section of the SOAP note where we document the interventions that we planned while in the session and used during the session. These interventions may also correspond to the treatment we plan to continue using. So to remember where to put the interventions in a SOAP note, I like to think of it as perhaps a SOAPy note, spelled with an I for interventions. So in our Note Designer SOAP note, we see the Interventions subtab here, followed then by the subtab to document the client's response to the interventions. That is, information that should certainly inform our ongoing plan about how to intervene in the future. The next note we're going to consider is the BIRP note. This seems to be a more recent addition to the note type playing field, and I think has a number of significant merits, while also having a very memorable name. BIRP is an easy-to-remember acronym for Behavior, Intervention, Response, and Plan. So again, let's take a look at how we see this in the Note Designer program. So after you've entered all the usual demographic information, the first section of the note is Behavior. Behavior here includes all of the information conveyed to you by the client, any third parties, and as derived also from your own clinical observations and assessment. Essentially, it's collapsing both the S and O aspects of the SOAP note that we just talked about. So here we have the session format, that is where the session took place, along with appearance, that being the approach to the appointment as well as the physical appearance of the client, then followed by the observed affective state of the client. Next, we have the reported affective state of the client. So that is what the client describes as their state of emotion or state of being. Sometimes you may even include quotes from the client if you think it adds. In Note Designer, you can do this either at the end of the tab or in Final Edit on the right of the screen before saving the note. And also their observed mental state. This might include, for instance, what you deduced from your mini mental examination. Here we may choose also to include, as needed, some indication of the overall functioning of the client, such as found with a global assessment of functioning or a levels of functioning indicator. In Note Designer, we include a place to remark on any particular assessment instruments administered and any relevant results. We also include a place to record any noteworthy biopsychosocial factors described or observed. And again, I'll remind you, you do not have to use every subtab or aspect of the Note Designer note. You can leave them out. Really depends on what you need in your particular environment. Now let's turn to the intervention section. Here is where we document what essentially happened during the session. In particular, the major themes discussed and explored, as well as the specific interventions we implemented during the session. Again, I'll underscore how important this part of the note is for the client's record. It is part of our accountability as professionals for what we actually do with our clients and how we impact them. For instance, if our work with a client is ever questioned, we will have a clear documentation of what we actually did, and hopefully it was consistent with the standards in the profession. Without such documentation, we leave ourselves open to justified criticism, as it'll be unclear what we did, if anything, to help the client. Returning to our note, we see here that we might organize our thinking about the themes discussed by referring to common content areas. So we have here relational issues, couple-family specific themes, identity, mourning, trauma, themes related to the process of the treatment itself, and then again some specific problem areas that might have been explored. As with all of our Note Designer notes, you can simply select what you did over here, and then it shows up over on the right-hand side in a coherent narrative. Again, if we look at the Therapeutic Intervention subtab, we see the interventions are organized according to general therapeutic orientation. So here we have supportive, CBT, including things like DBT and ACT, as well as psychodynamic. As an aside, I'll just mention it's interesting to note that some research suggests clinicians from one orientation frequently also use interventions from another orientation, sometimes without ever really identifying it as such. So some CBT clinicians may sometimes be making the equivalent of psychodynamic interpretations, while a psychoanalyst may sometimes implement cognitive or mindfulness interventions. I found this while involved in some psychotherapy process research many years ago, where we compared verbatim transcripts of psychotherapy sessions conducted by therapists from different orientations. And as we know, what goes on in psychotherapy sessions is so complex, there is likely a lot happening that we can never adequately quantify or document, but we do our best. Now let's turn to the R of the BIRP note. This one is response. Here we see this pertains to all things related to the response of the client to the work done in the session. So most directly, we can include how the client responded to our interventions and the experience of the session. For instance, they may have been very appreciative and found it helpful, or perhaps they responded with some frustration or skepticism about the work done. We might also note here any significant developments, as well as any outstanding therapeutic concerns. These, in a more general sense, being responses to the treatment or a consequence of the treatment. And last, we have the plan section. In the BIRP note format, it is here where we simply focus on the ongoing treatment plan, maybe including the time frame for meeting goals and objectives, as well as any homework assigned and the date and time of the next session. We will turn now to the final note type, that being the DAP note. In this kind of note, we have fewer major sections to remember, but of course, each section is going to be populated by more content. Let's take a look. DAP is an acronym for Data, Assessment, and Plan. It is sometimes referred to as a DARP note with an R, where response is given as a separate section after the assessment. So again, after all of the relevant demographic information is entered in Note Designer using the Headings tab, we begin with all of the data. Let's turn to that tab. Data will include all subjective and objective things observed, reported, and that transpired during the session. Essentially, these are our data points from the session. So if we look at the Data tab in Note Designer, for instance, we find all of the usual observables, such as the location of the session, the client's approach to the session, client's appearance. This is followed by the client's reported and observed affective state and observed mental state. And next, we would include here all that transpired, such as the themes discussed during the session, organized according to those handy categories in Note Designer, and any interventions we may have implemented, CBT, supportive, dynamic, and so on. And then last, we would include here the client's reported or observed responses to our interventions. After documenting all of that data, we then move to the assessment section. This is where we explain what we assess or otherwise evaluate or conclude to be at play as based on the data we encountered during the session. So here we would document such things as the assessed global level of functioning, the overall level of functioning of the client, as well as what we've found to be significant developments and any ongoing areas of concern. In the Note Designer DAP template, we also include a slot for entering any specific assessment instruments administered, relevant results, and any biopsychosocial factors that should be considered. And this brings us to the final section of the DAP note, the plan. This is essentially the same as that in the BIRP note. So here we would document our ongoing treatment plan, perhaps also indicating the time frame to meet our goals, behavioral targets, and objectives, followed by any therapeutic homework tasks we might have assigned, and finally the date and time of the next session. And that concludes our DAP style note. That brings us to the end of this educational video on the different types of psychotherapy progress notes. Based on my experience, I would have to say that I personally find the basic note, as I created it for Note Designer, so there's a little bias there, as well as the BIRP note type to be most helpful in the context of documenting psychotherapy sessions. But this is my opinion. No matter what type of note format you use to do your notes, in the end, all that really matters is that they're done. Even if you are really pressed for time, at a minimum, please be sure to document the date and time of the session, what you actually did with your clients, for example, themes discussed and interventions used, and any outstanding issues either reported or that emerged, and fill in the rest when you have a moment. This has been Patricia for Note Designer, the leading creators of psychotherapy note writing software for mental health professionals. If you have any questions or comments about Note Designer, please feel free to send us an email at info@notedesigner.com. We are always happy to hear from you.